Well, hello there, gunfighters, and welcome to Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gun-adjacent topics the right way, with God at the center. Judeo-Christian values and real-world first-hand experience. Bio is going to be in the show notes. I may talk a little bit about my background as it's germane to today's topic, which is going to be the big three 9mm grain weights: 115, 124, and 147. Which one is right for you? How do they compare? What are you gaining? What are you giving up? That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Side note, if my voice sounds a little different, it's because I'm getting over being sick. It is what it is. The show must go on. On that note, please like, subscribe, leave a review of the podcast. Also, quick caveat, if you are listening to this on YouTube, a lot of the Caliber stuff does well on YouTube. This is primarily a podcast. This is why there's no video. This is a podcast. I put it on YouTube because it's a button that I click and it can go to YouTube. I don't particularly have any love for YouTube, so I would encourage you to check out Gunfighter Life Podcast on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, whatever you want. There's a bunch of different podcast platforms. It's probably on there. Okay, 9mm. It is the de facto handgun cartridge of our time. Period. It is. You can like it or not. You can throw a fit. You can stomp your feet. You can put your hands over your ears and shake your head. It is. It is by far the most popular, most common defensive handgun round of our time. I'm not saying it's the best for everything, but it's usually the best for most people for most things. And I went through this phase, right? I think a lot of new shooters go through this phase where they just want something different. I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I was issued many weapons, but when it was a handgun, it was a Beretta M9, 9mm. I went to work for L.A.P.D. I shot the 40. That Glock 40, even I knew with my limited handgun training, that thing is an abomination. And I thought, I gotta go 45. So I had my 45 phase. Got a couple of 45s, competed with 45s, got into competition shooting, which led me to actually running shots on the clock. Not just, I think this is really good in some abstract context. Like, how many good solid hits can I get at different distances on targets in an acceptable zone in an acceptable amount of time? And I quickly found that 9mm was far better at that. You couldn't convince me that one, maybe two 40 or 45 rounds is better than 3 or 4 or 5 9mm rounds in the same amount of time. Just didn't see that. And then I got into my bargaining phase. Like, I'm going to run 9mm, but it's going to be plus P, or even, I ran for quite a while, plus P plus in my law enforcement. I'll do 9mm, but it's going to be plus P plus. And I think a lot of people go through that phase. We'll revisit plus P and plus P plus in a while. But when I became older, hopefully wiser, more mellow, I realized that just standard 9mm is generally the best way to go. And again, it's not always the best, but for most people, for most things, I think that it is. Which leads us to, there's so many, because it is the standard, there are so many loads. There are so many different grain weights. But there's three major ones, which we're going to talk about today. How do you navigate that? That complex roadmap that is the 9mm. Well, let's start off and go down the line of grain weights. Now, 9mm here in America is most commonly in 115 grain, especially American-made loads. If you care about that, it's most commonly in 115 grain. It's a real common grain weight. I would say the most common grain weight. Because of economy of scale, and simply because you're going to be using less heavy metals, it's generally the cheapest. Now, you can find a really screaming deal on other grain weights, but in general, in America, in the year of our Lord 2025, the 115 grain is generally the most affordable. That is perhaps its biggest strength. It is most affordable in 115 grain. There are a is a wide variety, perhaps the widest variety of ammunition in the 115. Also, because it's how physics work and you need a certain amount of power to run a handgun properly, run a slide properly, compress the recoil spring, get it back into battery, they're all going to have about the same amount of power, and you can emote all over about that, but it is what it is. You got 115 grain to, cycle a 16-pound recoil spring and the weight of the slide. You're going to need a certain amount of power. So the 115 grain is going to have a little bit more velocity in general than 124s or 147s. So if you're a velocity guy, if you are, velocity, you're like, that's your most important part of your equation. If that's you, then 115 grain is where it's at. On the main, you could obviously go way off the rails and go way lighter. I don't recommend that for the big advantage of affordability and availability. You can find 90 grain bullets, but they're not common. So 115 grain. It is kind of the most common here in America. It's generally going to be the fastest if you run it across the board. If you compare standard pressure to standard pressure or plus P to plus P, it's going to be the most common, and it's going to be the most affordable, and it's going to be fast. Those are its big advantages. Now 124. 124 is, I would say, kind of the international standard because of NATO. And NATO rounds generally NATO rounds are 124 grain. And another thing, and this is not true of all, there are plenty of standard pressure 124 grains, but I would consider most of the NATO stuff plus P, meaning more pressure. If you're the guy that wants plus P, or you honestly have a gun that was built for plus P, and some of them are, especially more international type guns, they were meant to run on NATO ammo. And despite what we might think of, the Europeans as being effeminate, they actually generally load their ammo for a given caliber a lot of times hotter than we do. So a lot of that European NATO ammo is going to be hotter than our American domestic stuff. So it's probably the second most common. It's maybe going to be a little bit more expensive than 115 grain, but it's very, very common. It's the second most affordable in general. Again, you can find deals on anything. And it's much more common to find rounds. You're going to find a lot more plus P or high pressure rounds in 124 because of the international stuff than you are in the other grain weights. And you can find plus P in pretty much any grain weight that I can think of. However, it's the most common and most affordable in plus P ammo in the 124s. And obviously, it has a little bit more weight in the projectile. So obviously 124 weighs a little bit more than 115. Also, not exclusive to the 124s, but because a lot of it is NATO ammo, and you can find this in other grain weights, but since a lot of it is NATO ammo, a lot of the cheaper NATO ammo is going to be water sealed and like military spec. Now, there are some downsides to that too. They can have hard primers, and the brass can be a giant pain in the butt to reload. Ask me how I know. Because they a lot of times will smash the outside of that primer pocket to keep that primer in there if it's being shot out of, let's say, a submachine gun, so it doesn't come out, which can be a giant pain in the butt when you go to reload it. But if you want like storage ammo, sealed ammo, watertight, more water, I guess not watertight, you dump it in the ocean and come back a year later, it's probably not going to work. But water resistant ammo, that is generally going to be your most affordable option. So fairly available, fairly affordable, a lot of times high pressure, a lot of times water sealed, and it's going to be, we'll call it a welterweight, a middleweight, welterweight kind of round. Maybe you give up a little bit of velocity, but you gain a little bit of grain weight. Now, let's talk about the 147. 147s are generally the most expensive. Makes sense, they have the most heavy metal in the bullet. They're also the least common. So, doesn't seem up front like they have a lot of advantage. I am going to tell you, to be honest with you, that 147s are my personal favorite. And this is a couple of reasons why. Again, general statement, but generally your 115 and 124s are going to be round nose bullets. Generally your 147 is going to be a flat pointed truncated cone, at least flat pointed. In general, those bullets drive deeper in straight line penetration, and they do better ballistically if we're comparing FMJ to FMJ. Now hold on, I am not suggesting that you carry FMJ as your CCW ammo, as your carry ammo, as your duty ammo. I'm not suggesting that. However, when a hollow point does not expand, pretty much performs like an FMJ. There are some really, really good hollow points on the market. I've talked about that before. This is not really in today's episode to get into all the different hollow points. I've revisited that recently. I'm not going to insult your intelligence. You can use the search engine and find it. But when a hollow point, no matter how good it is, sometimes a hollow point will not expand for whatever reason, right? It's outside the design parameters, meaning like you're shooting at a longer range, you're below the expansion threshold, hit something that clogged the hollow point, it was at a funny angle, it hit a bone just right. There's a bunch of reasons why. No matter how perfect the bullet is, sometimes weird things happen in ballistics. If the hollow point does not expand, or if it is an FMJ, in general the truncated cones do better. That's a big reason I like 147s. Also, for me personally, I have shot quite a bit, won quite a few competitions, done a lot of competition shooting, and a lot with the 9mm. Other calibers too, but the 9mm I think I've won more competitions with than anything else. Recoil is manageable. It's one of the reasons it's so popular. Now, the recoil impulse is going to be different between a 115, a 124, and a 147. If they're loaded to standard, they're all going to have about the same numbers as far as foot-pounds and energy and stuff like that, but the way that you interact with the recoil, you may prefer one over the other. You may prefer a snappier snap up, snap back down recoil. You may prefer a slow roll of a recoil, like a more elongated rounding wave than a snap. The best way I can think to describe it if you don't know what I'm talking about. The 147s tend to have that slower arc. Also, kind of obviously, the 147 weighs quite a bit more. We're talking about you go from a 115 to a 124, 9 grains of difference, but a significant jump up when you go from 124 to 147. And, in my opinion, some of the best defensive loads are in the heavier grain weights, like 147. Not exclusive. There are good ballistic performers in any of these grain weights. There are good 115s, good 124s, 147s, but I prefer, and I think ballistics will bear that out, many of the top performers in the ballistics of 9mm are in that 147 grain weight. A 147 Ranger T, a 147 Federal HST, a 147 Spear Gold Dot, or 147 G2. When they went to the G2, the second generation of Spear Gold Dots, I think they only make it in 147. And if you want to look at the end from the beginning and think what really good defensive load, or one or two options in case I can't get one, which one of those do I want to trust my life to in my 9mm, I tend to go with the 147. And because one of the things I think often overlooked but is super important is you need to, I shouldn't say need to, it is best practice in my opinion for you to shoot a practice ammo that shoots the same point of aim, point of impact as your defensive load. So if I know that I want a 147 defensive load, I will generally pick that 147 defensive load and then work backwards. A real easy one would be, a Spear Gold Dot 147. Got it on my hip right now. And then Speer makes their matching Lawman ammo. It's a match, same kind of bullet shape and all that stuff to match up to that ammo. So I can buy a case of Speer Lawman 147 and I can carry 147 gold dots. I'm not saying that's the only way to go. I also really like Winchester Ranger Ts. In fact, I think I like them a little bit better. They're just sometimes hard to find. So I could, get the Winchester Ranger T, and then I could get a Winchester 147 grain, make sure that it shoots the same point of aim, point of impact, and run that way. And again, even the FMJs are going to be truncated cones or at least flat fronted, which tend to do better ballistically than just a round-nosed bullet. Yes, they do cost a little bit more, and they are a little bit less available. The reason I'm thinking about this so much is I'm trying to help a patron get through this and what ammo he's going to stockpile and all this stuff, something we do for each other on Patreon. But, know yourself. I like to buy my ammo by the case. There's plenty of 9mm 147 on the internet. If you're going to your local, farm supply store or XYZ sporting goods store, and they've got a couple of different 9mm on the shelf, you may not even find 147. And if that's you and that's what you're going to do, I'm not saying that's good, but if you know that's what you're going to do, you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to go out with my buddy and shoot this month. I better stop by the store the day before. Probably 147 is not for you. They may not even have it. If you're the kind of guy that's like, I'm serious about this, I know my defensive load, I know what shoots the same point of aim, point of impact, fired by me out of my gun, I'm going to buy a case this month. I've got some money set aside. I'm going to buy a case this month of 147s. You're going to spend a few bucks more, but not a lot more. In my opinion, you get better ammo. So 147 going to cost a little bit more. You're also going to get a heavier bullet and in general a better bullet profile. You're going to get, you may prefer that less sharp recoil impulse. And again, in my opinion, some of the best defensive loads are in 147. Now, they are not a sponsor of the show, but just to show you some of these numbers here. Now, these are not set in stone. These may change from the time you listen to this. I just typed in on AmmoSeek, not a sponsor, they're just a search engine that searches for ammo. Prices at the time I'm recording this. For some like special promotionals, you can only have a couple of boxes, but when we get down to what I would consider ammo you can buy in bulk, no surprise, the cheapest is 9mm 115 grain, 8 cents per round. 250 rounds for $20. No surprise, the next cheapest grain weight listed is 124 grain, and it's 11.2 cents a round. And if I look at 147, it's 19 cents a round. Now, I'm not going to look on AmmoSeek to see how many they have in total, because it would just be more than I wanted to count. But if we go to Midway USA, also not a sponsor, just a site that I like and like to use for gun stuff. If I look at ammo, 115 grain 9mm that they have listed, 75 results. It will be like different SKUs, different boxes, whatever. Different types of 9mm 115 grain, we get 75 results. For the 124 grain, we have 66 results. And for 147, we get 48 results. So that kind of bears out what we talked about in the beginning. Now, which one is right for you? Well, only you know that. I'm not going to be so conceited as to think that I know what's best for every single person out there. I do not. Have a hard enough time trying to figure out what God wants me to do in life. But I've given you, I think, a pretty fair and honest assessment of the advantages and drawbacks of each. Is the cost the primary factor? Well, then you're probably going to go 115 and pick the best defensive load that you can match with that you can. But if you're just trying to buy, especially in bulk, like my ammo budget is whatever. Say it's for 9mm ammo budget is $250 every quarter. Probably better off saving and buying in bulk by the case than you are to nickel and dime box at a time. That's like buying beef jerky at the gas station where you pay 10 or 12 bucks for it. In an emergency or on a long road trip, if it's the healthiest of the snacks, maybe get it, but probably don't buy beef jerky at the gas station as part of your daily diet if you care about saving money. Same with ammo. So let's just say your ammo budget is $250 a quarter, like meaning every 3 months. Well, you're going to get more with 115 grain generally, again, unless you find some crazy sale, but we're talking about the long term. If you're into shooting and training, you should be in it for the long term. 115 grain makes the most sense. It's usually the most affordable. You are literally going to get the most bang for your buck. I don't think it's the best ballistic performer. Don't always like heavier for caliber bullets. It really depends on the application. But for the 9mm, I generally like heavier for caliber. This is generally the lightest commonly available bullet grain weight. But if you're into velocity, it's generally going to have the highest velocity. Now let's talk about the 124. It's still readily available. It's not much more in cost. We saw that when we looked up the cost per round. It's not much more than 115. However, you do get a step up in grain weight. So if you're a middle of the road kind of guy, hedge your bets kind of guy, I want decently affordable ammo and a little bit heavier bullet. And or maybe you want to shoot plus P and you want affordable plus P ammo to train with. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to, carry plus P when you train with standard pressure. The likelihood it's going to shoot in the same place and recoil the same is almost zero. So if that is you, then you might give a good hard look at the 124s. If you want the best, in my opinion, ballistic performance, straight line penetration, flat fronted, usually flat fronted and more often truncated cone. If you want a good training ammo for, again, in my opinion, some of the best ballistic performer defensive ammo, and you're willing to spend a little bit more money, then 147 might be your best bet. Now, a quick caveat here, there are other grain weights. There are like 127. There is the 135 is becoming more popular. The Hornady Critical Duty 135 plus P is a pretty good ballistic performer, I'm not going to lie. My issue with those grain weights are finding practice ammo that you're going to be able to practice with. You could probably find maybe 135 grain plus P with a similar bullet profile to train with, but I'm not aware of very many, and you're probably going to spend more for that than 147s. So there are many other grain weights, of course, in the 9mm, but the big three, 115, 124, and 147s. Nothing wrong with buying a few boxes of each and seeing which one you like, diving into the ballistics of each. Maybe you're a speed guy. Maybe you want the 115. Maybe you're a plus P guy. That's going to skew you in one direction. Maybe you're a heavy for caliber, truncated cone, flat fronted. Maybe that appeals to you. Then the 147 is going to be it. Now this decision, I think, is important. It's an important decision, something you may be trusting your or other people's lives to. It's an important decision. But don't get analysis paralysis. One of the reasons I'm doing this is to help you. Obviously, there are some differences in the different grain weights and how they perform. However, you're better off just picking one and running with it, whether it's 115 grain, 124, 147, getting a good amount of training ammo, actually training, taking some professional training, not just going to an indoor range and shooting at a static target, getting some actual professional defensive handgun training with a certain grain weight and getting a good expanding hollow point ammunition that matches ballistically, same point of aim, same point of impact, and running with that, you're better off making the choice, having the ammo, having the training, than not having that and a slightly better grain weight. So don't get analysis paralysis. Make an informed, educated decision. There's no wrong answer here. And train. And buy ammo, hopefully in bulk. Psalm 144, Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle.